Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 13 in our History Bites series. Today we will discuss slavery and the fight for emancipation in the United States. By the time of the American Civil War, which began in April of 1861, the slavery issue had been a divisive topic for many years. Many people and leaders of the North have been primarily concerned with stopping the extension of slavery into Western territories that would eventually achieve statehood within the Union. There was the Compromise of 1850, which made California a free state, while the new territories of Utah and New Mexico decided through popular sovereignty if they would permit slavery. Sectional tensions over slavery in the United States have been building for decades by 1854. That year, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened territory that had been previously closed to slavery according to the Missouri Compromise. Opposition to the act led to the formation of the Republican Party in 1854 and revived the failing political career of an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who rose from obscurity to national prominence and claimed the Republican nomination for president in 1860. In March of 1857, the United States Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, declared that all blacks, slave as well as free, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. The court also declared the 1820 Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, thus permitting slavery in all of the country's territories. The case before the court was that of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, a slave who had lived in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin before moving back to the slave state of Missouri, had appealed to the Supreme Court in hopes of being granted his freedom, but was denied. Abolitionists were incensed. Although disappointed, Frederick Douglass found a bright side to the decision and announced, "My hopes were never brighter than now." For Douglass, the decision would bring slavery to the attention of the nation and was a step toward slavery's ultimate destruction. On the evening of October 16, 1859, John Brown, a staunch abolitionist, and a group of his supporters left their farmhouse hideout en route to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Descending upon the town in the early hours of October 17th, Brown and his men captured prominent citizens and seized the federal armory and arsenal. Brown had hopes that the local slave population would join the raid, and through the raid's success, weapons would be supplied to slaves and freedom fighters throughout the country. However, this was not to be. In the late afternoon, U.S. Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived and stormed the engine house, killing many of the raiders and capturing Brown. Brown was quickly placed on trial and charged with treason against the state of Virginia, and also charged with murder and slave insurrection. Brown was sentenced to death for his crimes and hanged on December 2, 1859. Novelist and poet Herman Melville called Brown the meteor of the war. President Lincoln personally hated slavery and considered it immoral, but Lincoln didn't believe the Constitution gave the federal government the power to abolish it in the states where it already existed, only to prevent its establishment to new Western territories that would eventually become states. In his first inaugural address in early 1861, he declared that he had, quote, "no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists," end quote. By that time, however, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America and setting the stage for the Civil War. At the outset of the conflict, Lincoln insisted that the war was not about freeing enslaved people in the South, but about preserving the Union. 4 border slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained on the Union side, and many others in the North also opposed abolition. When one of his generals, John C. Fremont, put Missouri under martial law, declaring that Confederate sympathizers would have their property seized and their enslaved people would be freed, Lincoln directed him to reverse the policy, and later removed him from command. In July 1862, Congress passed the Militia Act, which allowed black men to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces as laborers, and the Confiscation Act, which mandated that enslaved people seized from Confederate sympathizers would be declared forever free. Lincoln also tried to get the border states to agree to gradual emancipation, including compensation to slave owners, with little success. When abolitionists criticized him for not coming out with a stronger emancipation policy, Lincoln replied that he valued saving the Union over all else. Quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery," he wrote in an editorial published in the Daily National Intelligencer in August 1862. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." End quote. Lincoln, concerned above all with the preservation of the Union, drafted the proclamation in part as a political and part as a military stratagem because it had the potential to recruit former slaves for the Union Army while weakening the Confederacy. Members of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet gathered at the White House on July 22, 1862, to hear the president read his draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. There were mixed reactions amongst the men, but Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase wrote in his diary, "The question of arming slaves was then brought up, and I advocated it warmly." However, Secretary of State William Seward offered a cautious approach. He told the president that he should wait to issue the proclamation once a major Union victory on the battlefield had been achieved. That victory came on September 17, 1862, when the Union Army held off the Confederates at the Battle of Sharpsburg, also known as the Battle of Antietam. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Written by Lincoln alone without consultation from his cabinet, the proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves in states that were still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, quote, "shall be thenceforward, and forever free." On January 1st, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which included nothing about gradual emancipation, compensation for slave owners, or black immigration and colonization, a policy Lincoln had supported in the past. Lincoln justified emancipation as a wartime measure and was careful to apply it only to the Confederate states currently in rebellion. Exempt from the proclamation were the 4 border slave states and all or parts of 3 Confederate states controlled by the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation did more than lift the war to the level of a crusade for human freedom. It brought some substantial practical results because it allowed the Union to recruit black soldiers. To this invitation to join the Army, blacks responded in considerable numbers, nearly 180,000 of them enlisting during the remainder of the war. By August 26, 1863, Lincoln could report in a letter to James C. Conkling that, quote, "The emancipation policy and the use of colored troops constitute the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebellion," end quote. 2 months before the war ended, in February 1865, Lincoln told portrait painter Francis B. Carpenter that the Emancipation Proclamation was, quote, "the central act of my administration and the greatest event of the 19th century," end quote. To Lincoln and his countrymen, it had become evident that the proclamation had dealt a death blow to slavery in the United States, a fate that was officially sealed by the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and I'll see you all next time.